Hello, everyone, and welcome to this talk about tourism in Iceland. Actually, the talk is about my own personal experience with some things that I've struggled with, some ways that I've made some personal growth. I'm sharing those things with you. Does not mean that I have a theory of everything or I know what things might work for you or not, but my hope is that in sharing some of what I've learned in my travels, you yourself may be inspired to do some similar research or make some similar personal growth, or perhaps check off whatever it is that has worked for me and say, that doesn't work for me, now I don't need to read the book, I'll go do something else. But this is just a very personal talk. I'm going to share with you some stuff which has actually been researched by people who actually do controlled studies and so on, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a guarantee that anything in there is going to be the right thing for you. It could just be that this is a chance for us to just spend an hour getting to know each other or getting to know me a little bit better. I'm going to talk about the concept of optimism, and conversely, its opposite, pessimism. I'm going to describe for you one framework for measuring, actually objectively measuring, whether people are generally optimistic or pessimistic. I'll talk about some research that has been done which can change people's optimism and pessimism, and some connections between that and other things in their life, such as their productivity with work, or what they recount as their happiness, which of course is a separate concept from optimism. I'm also going to talk about another framework called mindsets, which many of you may have heard of as well. And I'm going to talk about how these two frameworks fit together. And I think that's an hour. So let's get started. A number of years ago, I was in a very low point in my life. I was in a very dark place. As it happens, I came upon a book. I read the book. It spoke to me. I followed some of the instructions in the book. It changed my life. That, of course, is not a guarantee that it's going to change anybody else's life. And it's also not a guarantee that had I read that book a year earlier or a year later that it would have changed my life. A lot of things are like this. The seed has to fall upon fertile ground, and then the rain has to come, to use a metaphor. So there's a lot of things that went together into making that work for me. But in sharing this with you, I hope that you'll hear enough to be able to judge for yourself whether this is something you want to learn about and do a little bit more research into it. And of course, I am just one person giving my impressions of how things were. So what I would say to you is, if what I say sounds intriguing, follow up. If what I say doesn't sound intriguing, say to yourself, well, that one guy didn't think much of it, but maybe I should follow up anyway. The book is Learned Optimism, and it was written by a Dr. Martin Seligman, based on his research. And he did a lot of research, and actual research, as opposed to, hey, I wrote a book based on my theories of life or my personal experiences. And I really want to emphasize this question of research, because research is not the same thing as intuition. Research involves measuring. That is the scientific method. You make a conjecture, you come up with an experiment to which you do not know the answer yet, and then you conduct the experiment, and the experiment may falsify your theory of everything, in which case you have to crumple it up and start over again or make changes. Or if it does verify it, you say to yourself, well, I haven't disproved it yet. That's how science works. And a lot of things that have to do with personal motivation or personal development do not follow this model. They follow the model of, I thought of something cool. I'm really good at standing on stage and giving TED Talk type things like I'm doing now, so I will just share it with people and I will sell people a book. And that's not what Dr. Martin Seligman does. And Dr. Seligman's theory that he came up with is that people's behavior is very largely driven by the way they explain the world to themselves. This is called explanatory theory. He has a little corner of explanatory theory. It's a larger theory, If anyone has ever suffered from depression and does cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the things you do is write down what you think happened to you and why, and then you dispute it with yourself and you write down a new explanation for things that happened to you and so on. There's a large body of work into explanatory theory, and he had one little corner of it. And the way we explain things to each other is very, 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 it's prevalent in everything we do. For example, if at the end of my talk, one or two people applaud and a bunch of other people don't, and then people walk out, I might say to myself, my talk was no good, no applause. Or I might say to myself, well, you know, people did applaud that talk when I gave it in North America, but not in Norway. Perhaps Norwegian people are just a little bit more reserved about sharing what they think. I don't actually know which of those two things might or might not be true. But there's a general thing where we make a little explanation to ourselves, and you can sort of see how your character or your mood might influence the way you explain things to yourself. And then there's a feedback loop. When you're constantly telling yourself these little stories about why things happen to you, that affects your character and your mood. This much is well established. What Dr. Seligman did is he went into more detail about those and tried to connect it to these two things he called optimism and pessimism. He made two claims about our explanations. The first is that our explanations have specific patterns that we can identify in an objective way, and if we identify the patterns, we can predict the way people will behave from the patterns that are present in the explanations they give for things that happen to them in their life. So this is an objective process. And from that, he said, so I will create a test, and the test will come out with an objective thing, like a number. And the number will go from, let us say, I don't think this is exactly how it is, but from plus 10 to minus 10. And if it's all the way at plus 10, I'll call them a raving optimist. And if they're all the way at minus 10, I'll call them a raving pessimist. And people in the middle will be balanced or whatever, or normal distribution. I'm not sure of all the exact details of the things in the math. But he claimed that he could write this test, and then there would be a way to objectively measure people's behavior and their moods, and he would be able to link them together, so that by giving somebody the test, it would be predictive. And that, of course, is a falsifiable theory, because what you can do is after you've assembled this test, you can go out and give it to a whole bunch of other people you've never met before, and then measure their behavior. And you can do it in a kind of double-blind way, so that the people who are measuring the behavior don't know the test scores of the people, and the people who take the test score don't know about the behavior. And then if you match them up, and there is the correspondence that the theory predicts, well, then you haven't falsified the theory. But if there isn't the correspondence, then you know that the theory is no good. And that is the scientific method, and that's what he did. His second claim is way more interesting. Because, of course, if somebody came to me and said, I have an infallible way of determining whether or not you're going to be happy for the rest of your life, and they stopped right there and said, do you want to take the test? I'd be horrified. I'd say, no, don't come near me with that. This kind of knowledge of the future with no ability to change it is terrible. It would be, what if you told me that I was only going to be happy for 50% of the rest of my days? I'd spend every day saying, is this one of my few precious happy days or not? You know, it would just warp my own personal mind. The second claim is the one that matters to me, because his claim was that by doing specific things, you could change your score. And again, his score is not actually from minus 10 to plus 10. But let's say if you're a 3, you can become a 5. If you're a minus 2, you can become a 0. If you're a minus 5, you can become a minus 3. He claimed that with specific, you might call it therapy or practices, you can move your score. And that when you move the score, it still has the predictive behavior, so it changes your moods and behaviors afterwards. It's not just that you can change the score without changing your moods and behavior. You can change your moods and behavior, and the score essentially is predicting that change. And again, this is something that can be tested. And he tested it, and he claims I was not looking over his shoulder, so I'll often say he claims. He claims that he has the evidence to show this is the case. Now, as I said, the second claim is the one that is so important to me. The first claim is what I would call the Cassandra thing. You might know that disaster is coming, but you're powerless to do it. To me, that's a nightmare. I have these helpless nightmares every once in a while. You know something's going to happen, but there's nothing you can do about it. That's terrible. However, when you have something you can do about it, then it's really important to be able to diagnose and to be able to go and look at it and find out what's going on, because then you can make change in the world. So, I mentioned that his work is based on explanatory theory. These explanations we make for ourselves. And I gave you a little example. What would I take it if there wasn't a lot of applause at a talk? And this is all over the place. So here's an example. In 2009, I was registering for a conference called Ruby Fringe in Toronto. Now, at the time, I'd written a gem for Ruby called And. And there was a person there, someone I respected very much from the tech community in Toronto, walked up and said to me, "You're Reg Braithwaite." I felt good about that. I don't know how you feel about it, but if you go to a conference and someone says, "Hey, I know, I've heard of you," that's a nice feeling. What came next was, "You wrote that And gem." This, for me, goes from good to better. They've heard of me and my work. And then he said, "I don't like it." I work at a company called PagerDuty, and one of our core values is candid kindness. I'm going to say this person had wired candid. Now, how did I explain that to myself? This is the core of Seligman's theory. And of course, the first of his claims. In his model, there are three independent and fairly binary properties or axes for every explanation you make for yourself. The first thing you do in your brain, implicitly or explicitly, is you decide whether this thing is a personal or impersonal effect or action. For example, when I got this feedback about the And gem, did I say to myself, my And gem, that thing I wrote? Or did I say to myself, that dude, his opinion, his perspective, his experience, his particular requirements in writing code, his coding style, his language of choice? Or did I come back to my documentation, the examples I gave for why it's good, my theories about it, option monad, my choices? Is it about me, or is it about the universe, somebody else, something else? So the first possibility, personal. Some people like And because I something, something, something. And the second possibility, impersonal. Some people dislike And because they something, something. And that axis is, in fact, a very core thing. And this runs through, I'm sure, every conversation you ever have involving feedback. It runs through anything you will ever read or be trained about or come up with yourself involving managing people, giving feedback, training people, being a parent, being a child of a parent. What things are about you and what things are not about you, good or bad. So Dr. Seligman figured he can measure that. And you can. There are different ways to test this kind of thing and measure whether people tend to explain things to themselves in a personal way or tend to explain things to themselves in an impersonal way. And he found some very interesting results. But before we get to that, I mentioned that there were three axes. The second axis is specific versus general. Remember the and? Of course you do. I've been talking about it for the last 5 minutes, and you're a very sharp and intelligent audience. When he gave me that feedback, did I say, he doesn't like and? Did I say, he doesn't like my code? Did I say, he doesn't like me? Did I say, he's a grouch, he doesn't like anything? Did I say, this guy has an issue with taking monadic patterns from actual real functional programming languages and trying to jam them into non-functional programming languages? You can, when making up explanations, be incredibly specific or be very broad and general. And once again, it's really easy to tell the difference. This happens to me, well, not all the time, but from time to time. Hacker News likes this blog post. Or I could say the exact same thing if a blog post of mine, say a completely different thing for the exact same event. A blog post of mine reaches the front page of Hacker News. Look at that. They're validating my experience as a programmer. That's much more general, isn't it, than they like this post? Or I happen to have posted it at the exact right time of day when it can reach the front page. And so Dr. Seligman noticed not only are there two different ways to measure explanations, personal, impersonal, specific, general, but that they tend to be a little orthogonal. Some explanations are personal and specific, impersonal and specific, personal, general, and so on. And that was very interesting, but there's still the third axis to look at. The third axis, or third axis of the three axes, is temporal, time. That feedback that I got, or perhaps a red card in a talk sometime, or perhaps a star on GitHub, was it, yeah, remember that time I got some feedback? Was it, oh yeah, that day I did get a star on GitHub for one of my projects? Or is it, yeah, over my career I have got some people who don't like my stuff? Is it, you know, in 35 years a lot of people have liked my work? Things can be very sort of specific in time, right now, right here, or they can be very general, over a long arc. And when measuring, Dr. Seligman noticed that this was a third axis that could be measured. Now, I have given this talk before. I try not to give it very much because it's actually kind of personal for me and I get kind of wound up. And I've written about it, and I often get feedback from people saying, well, isn't everything kind of just specific general? And not necessarily. When dealing with humans, you know, we have specific programs, and sometimes it might matter, even though in a certain abstract sense, they're all specific general, specific about you, or specific in general about the effect, or specific in general about time. But in actual fact, when he measured the three axes separately, he got better results than if he just tried to lump it all together. And that's how humans are. We're kind of messy, and we're not entirely sure why things are this way, but he found it very important to measure these three things. So in this third area, I might explain a successful project like this. Our work made this project a success. And I might explain it like this. This was just one highlight out of an ongoing, I hope this is the case, out of an ongoing arc of success in PagerDuty, which itself is on an ongoing arc of success. And what he found was being able to measure how people explain things with time was very important and very interesting. And he calls this temporary versus permanent. Which of your explanations describe something that's happening right now, and which of your explanations describe something that's kind of a permanent, ongoing, forever? Now, truthfully, none of these things are right or wrong answers. I did, that one time, get some feedback, which is also part of an ongoing arc of receiving feedback from people about code that I write. It's really just about the way we perceive these things. There's no right or wrong answer. But there is significance to how we give these answers, and there are ways that we can change these answers and change our life. So to recap, our behavior and our moods are driven by the way in which we explain things to each other. I haven't explained that, but it is. Dr. Seligman's discovery was that by measuring 3 related, but nevertheless he separated them, things, he could predict people's performance, their moods, their happiness. The 3 things are, first, whether they tended to explain things in a personal or impersonal way. Second, whether they explained the things as being very specific or very general in effect. And the third, whether they explained them in a very temporary way, or whether they explain them as part of a permanent, ongoing phenomena. Now, let me tell you a little bit about my experience. You might want to ask yourself, as I recount this anecdote, how do you explain things to yourself? Do you tend to explain things to yourself in a personal or impersonal way? Again, there's no right answer. Take personal. I know people who are always going on about stuff that happens and it's their fault. I also can buy millions of books that say, in order to succeed in life, you must take responsibility for everything. What's the answer? Now, I told you at the very beginning that I came upon this book at a low point in my life. So I will tell you how I explained things to myself at the time. When I received a little piece of candid feedback, like, that ad gem of yours, I don't like it, I took it personally. My work, me, my gem, my choices. I thought this was evidence of a general flaw with my approach to software development, programming, life as a whole. And I thought to myself, this is part of my personality. It's part of who I am, my identity. I thought this was part of something that was a permanent facet of my life, or permanent part of my life. My explanations for things like criticism were personal, were general, and were permanent. But a funny thing, in my life, things sometimes went well for me too, even though I was in a low point in my life. At that exact same conference, I gave a talk called Ruby.rewrite.Ruby, which was about essentially macros in Ruby, which at the time was not a very popular concept, and it never became a very popular concept. And everyone basically thought it was way too complicated and junk until JavaScript came along, and now we love things like Babel and polyfills and all sorts of things like that, which essentially are macros. We compile one kind of JavaScript into another. So either I was really behind the curve with Lisp or ahead of the curve with JavaScript. Who knows? But people liked my talk, even though it wasn't very practical. And when I got that kind of feedback, I tended to explain it to myself as, yeah, macros are a good idea. That's impersonal, right? I tended to say, yeah, that talk worked out. Temporary. And specific. That talk, that one time, just to talk, not my general ability as a speaker or a writer or as a programmer or a curious person about possibilities, just that one thing. Can you see the asymmetry there? I had two completely separate ways of explaining things to myself depending upon whether they were positive or negative in my life. Sometimes those of us in tech like to think of ourselves as being super logical. That is bullshit. We can be inconsistent, we can be illogical, we can sell ourselves on things. We just know bigger words with which to give ourselves bullshit. This book gave me a bit of a mirror to look at my own inconsistency. I always explain bad things to myself as being about me, as being really general, as being forever. This is like a big load to carry when every bad thing in your life is this big. And the good things, I turn into little pebbles, almost like stones in my shoe. You know, really specific, just that one time, and not even about me. Almost like, you know, it stuck to me, the bottom of my foot as I was walking down the road, and sooner or later it would just get scraped off. It's not logical, but it is who I was. And I know you do not have to be a genius to answer this question correctly. Do you think Dr. Seligman measured me as being an optimist or a pessimist? Aha. It's not rocket science. Pessimists are people who have this negative asymmetry in the way they explain things to themselves. It's not about being more of a realist. It's not about always really being negative. It's not even about whether more negative things happen to your life. It's about the way in which you explain them to yourself. If you tend to explain things to yourself in an asymmetrical way, you are being pessimistic. If you do it all the time, you're being permanently pessimistic. However, I'm here to tell you that because of Dr. Seligman's second claim, it does not have to be that way. Now, being pessimistic in Dr. Seligman's terms is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not here to say, hey, you should get a doctor to look at that for you. I'm here to show you some tools if you want to make some changes. But there's reasons why people who are pessimistic continue to survive and sometimes thrive. It's not necessarily a bad thing. However, in my life, it was. And I was very interested in his second claim. Could I make different choices? What if I went the other way? Would you be surprised to find out that people with the other asymmetry exist? Anytime something good happens to them, it's about them. It's just one example of this very general good thing about them. And it's this thing that's always been with them, and you know what? Probably always will. That's how optimists explain good things to themselves. And what about the bad things? Because they do come along. Well, it's not about them. It was just that one time. And it's just, you know, one specific thing. It's not, you know, the whole part of their life. They always turn the bad things into pebbles and the big good things into boulders. Now again, I'm not giving a value judgment that optimists are better. On average, his research shows that optimists are happier. On average, his research shows that optimists are more productive. These are things you may or may not wish to seek in your life, but in terms of our values as human beings, that's not what it's about. But then again, our values as human beings really isn't about the way we explain things to each other. They're about the changes we make in the world, the way we treat each other. These terms, pessimists, optimists, are tools, just like a microscope or glucose monitor, for learning things about ourselves so that we can, if we choose, make change that works. Now, his book was called Learned Optimism because it was about being able to learn to be more optimistic. And I have to tell you that when I read the book, I literally cried. It was like, oh my God, that's totally me. I see it. What should I do? The book described cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which was basically when things happen to you, writing them down in a diary, writing down your explanation as opposed to it implicitly floating around in your head, and then rewriting it in the optimistic form and looking at it and asking yourself, are both of these valid? It's not about brainwashing yourself into an optimistic form, but just recognizing, hey, I could explain this in either or two ways. And after a while of that flexibility, your mind naturally starts to drift towards a more balanced or possibly optimistic format. Just the act of being explicit. Now, this should not be a huge, amazing revelation for anyone, because we do this all the time with things like code. We might not notice the way we name variables unless maybe we submit a pull request and somebody says, hey, this could be clearer. And then we start thinking about our variable names, and the rest of them automatically start getting clearer just because we're suddenly thinking about our variable names. The act of making something explicit and understanding what the mechanism is often helps us to change by itself, provided it's coupled with consistent practice over and over again. So what I can tell you is, if after hearing this talk, you're interested enough to go out and get the book, Learned Optimism, you will find exercises in there. And you need to do them. I cannot teach you how to do the exercises here in the room, nor will I try. I'm not a psychologist, but he is. However, there may be some value in your being curious about that. But again, it's not about knowing the theory, it's actually about the exercises. Software is the same way, isn't it? I gave a talk earlier about the command pattern, and it's all very great. You may say, okay, now I know the command pattern, but it's only when you go out and actually start writing things with the pattern that you begin to get a feel for it, and then you begin to start noticing opportunities for it elsewhere in your code and so on. Our brains work this way. We have to practice, we have to do. It's not enough just to hear it intellectually. We have to sort of live it for a little while. So, what we have, and what I've shared with you in this brief time, is a theory about optimism versus pessimism, a way of measuring optimism and pessimism, and a way of making changes, which I haven't gone into in a lot of detail, but they exist and they're in the book, based on being sort of conscious and aware of it, and practicing explicitly by writing down new explanations. And his research showed that people who did that got more optimistic, and other positive things followed from them. Which to me is great, because that basic premise is that pessimism itself is temporary if you want it to be. And I can tell you from my n=1 anecdata, as we call it, or anecdatum, that my unhappiness was in fact temporary. When I followed this path, I got better. I got healthier. My mood improved in an important way. And that's the conclusion, and that was learned optimism. Now, what I've just given you is a slightly condensed version of a talk I've given a number of times. But it's not the only explanation for how people are successful and productive in their life. I know a number of successful people. And one thing I've noticed about them is that they often describe other people in general, in permanent, and personal ways. People will say, so-and-so is so smart. So-and-so is very intelligent. So-and-so knows everything you need to know about Elixir. So-and-so is always at the forefront of technology, and so on. Then I'll say, oh, cool, how about you? And then they're like, no, actually, I did this, and I did this, and I did this. They sound kind of pessimistic to me. And I'll say, well, there's got to be something, because you are as successful as so-and-so. People like your talks as much. Your blog posts make it onto the front page of Hacker News or Reddit or wherever that matters to them. And then they'll give a different explanation. They'll just say, no, actually, to tell you the truth, I just work harder than most smart people. I just write every day. One woman that I respect incredibly deeply, and if you Google, I'm sure you'll be able to catch the name. However, I have not asked her for permission to quote her, so I'm not going to mention her name right now. But she actually gives an entire talk where the title is a single word, grit. And that's what she attributes her success to. This seems very different and almost at odds with the optimism model. And in addition to that thing that I've observed, after I first started writing about learned optimism in a blog post, and I put it in one of my books, Hacker News one day discovered the speaker notes for an earlier version of this talk that just talked about learned optimism. And people started talking about a different theory and said, no, learned optimism is junk. It's been completely discredited by this other theory. And people would sometimes come up to me and say, well, yeah, but there's this other theory. And the other theory is called mindsets. And it was developed by a Stanford University psychologist called Dr. Carol Dweck. And she, like Dr. Seligman, did a lot of research into what made adults successful, and also did a lot of work with children and tracking children over long periods of time. And you've probably heard anecdotally either directly about mindsets, or you've heard a story which came out of her book, which has become sort of the totem for her work and her approach. And that is that if you tell a child that they're smart, they'll end up failing. They'll develop a kind of imposter syndrome. You're trying to make them feel permanently positive about a general attribute of theirs that is personal, but it actually kind of backfires. And they become afraid to take chances. They become afraid to be exposed as not as smart as it seems. They develop imposter syndrome. And a lot of people who've read that said, learned optimism sounds like you're trying to do the exact thing that Dr. Carol Dweck has done research into that says doesn't work. What's up with that? Now, her research was not about optimists versus pessimists. She talked about fixed and growth mindsets, as she called them. And the fixed mindset is all about permanent, personal characteristics. People with a fixed mindset think that they're smart or they're not smart. They think that they're athletic or they're not athletic. People with a growth mindset believe that almost everything of importance is a skill that can be learned, or is a characteristic that can be grown, and that there are specific methods and ways and things that happen to grow it. There may be genetic or whatever limitations. At age 55, if I haven't dunked a basketball yet, I'm unlikely to do it in the next 15 years or so. But on the whole, even if there may not be a guarantee that I can learn how to dunk a basketball, people with the growth mindset believe that if I practice jumping, I can certainly jump higher a year from now than I can jump today. They believe that everything is a skill that can be trained and improved. Now, I'll just say, her book, Mindsets, is amazing. And just like I said with Learned Optimism, if what you hear is intriguing, buy her book. Or read it. Or buy it and read it. Buy 5 copies and give 4 away to your friends and family. If what I say doesn't sound great, maybe explain it as being about me and temporary and specific, and go get her book anyway. Now, this fixed mindset is one that has a dark side. If you have a fixed mindset about being smart, what's the value of reading? If you think that you're smart or not smart, why are you even in this room? What is there you could possibly gain? It's fixed. You're smart. And so there is a dark side to that. And she focused on that in her work. And the flip side of that, the growth mindset, is one that believes everything is skill, and therefore is enabled. I mean, it doesn't mean that you will actually go out and train. You have to find the tools. You have to learn what they are. You might come here if you have a growth mindset and say, hey, maybe Reg has some experience he can share with me that I could use to improve my whatever. That's a growth mindset right there. And as I said earlier, the anecdote that sticks with most people because it has such emotional appeal is about children, because she'd actually done work with children. I think this is very important. And she said that, children are soft-brained, and the way in which we talk to them and the model we give them and the way we explain things to them about themselves affects their moods and so on, and has predictive power for how successful they will be decades later based on how we raise them or treat them as small children. I know this to be true, by the way. The most heartbreaking example to me is racism. We can argue about whether you should say racist things to me about black people or whatever. I'm done. I'm 55. I am somewhat set in things. I can learn things. I can grow. I might even learn things from a racist person about myself or people from where I come from and so on. But when you say racist things to small children, you are teaching them that there's nothing they can do. That even if they become president of the United States, the moment they're out of office, everyone will undo everything they did because they're black and nothing they do matters. That's a terrible burden to put on small children. And it does, in fact, affect their view of the world. And you see the reverse. This is people of privilege believe that they can do anything and get away with anything because they were taught that, well, they were born wealthy or they were born into nobility or something. And actually, they don't turn out to be great people even when you tell them super positive things about themselves. The fixed mindset is very damaging to children when put in that way. So she did the research, and it certainly speaks to me in my experience as a parent and as a former child, in some ways still current child, that we want to avoid this with children. But as much as that may be disastrous, what happens if we teach them the opposite, the growth mindset? What happens if we praise them not for who they are, but for what they did to earn our praise? In other words, oh, excellent essay, you're so smart. Instead of saying that, I love the ideas you incorporated into that essay. The work you did researching this really paid off, Thomas. My son's name is Thomas. Or my daughter. She asked me to read to her about Cantor's Calculus of the Infinities at night, 9 years old. I could say to her, oh, such a smart kid that you like infinities. Or I could say, fabulous choice of a book for us to read together. This is so interesting. Right? These little choices we make, we can imbue them with a growth mindset. And what are we telling them? The things you do matter to the world. The choices you make matter. And you're capable of making good choices. And hey, here's a permanent idea. If you're capable of making good choices at age 9, that's not going to go away. You'll still be making good choices at 19, 29, 39, 49, and if you come back to me in 4 years, I might say 59. They will hear that they just grew and they can continue to grow. Like Seligman, she discovered that mindsets can change. And like Seligman, the way in which mindsets change that she validated through her research was through cognitive behavioral therapy. Writing down explanations for yourself, and then writing a different explanation based on growth, and then saying to yourself, are these both valid? Very similar types of exercises. Again, don't just take what I said and think, aha, I know everything there is to know about changing my mindset. Please, read the original material. But what both researchers discovered is that you can change your mindset or the way you explain things to yourself. Both discovered that there are ways of measuring the way we behave and then making predictions from it. Both discovered that our brains are plastic. We have the ability to change, to improve. It's as true with technical subjects as it is with personal things like our mood. So everything's both a blessing and a curse. The blessing is all this reinforcement of the idea that we're plastic and we can improve. The curse is that the two appear to conflict. What's the deal with that? Can you be optimistic by explaining things in terms of your personal, permanent, and general things? Or is that the fixed mindset? What's up with that? So, getting back to kids, mostly because I'm a parent, and parents apparently love to talk about kids. There's a permanent thing that I don't think will change. I give it, let's say my son gets an A in drama. I mean the good drama, not Twitter drama. And I could explain it as his dramatic personality. I could explain it as the work he did in his character. Is there some way I could explain it that fits both models? If there is, then both models might work. Or is it that these two are completely disjunctive and one of them's wrong, we just haven't done the research to figure out which one? Well, I certainly could say something like this. You know, you've gotten A's in drama before, and every time it's because of the work you put into your characters and the enthusiasm you brought to it. That's fantastic, keep it up. I can say, you know, you can clearly see how well you've done with this, and that if you continue to bring your enthusiasm to the subject and to do the hard work of researching your characters and so on, you will continue to be successful. You can give people a sense of personal responsibility for good things in their life, a sense of generality to it. It's about enthusiasm and hard work, and permanence. You've been doing this, it's been working. Keep going. I have every confidence that you will continue to be successful when you continue to do the things that we see make this work. Those explanations actually fit both of the models. Did you get an A because you studied? Did you get an A because when you study, your grades improve? Did you get an A because, let's generalize it, when you study, you learn, and the grades reflect your learning, your growth as a human being. When we give feedback that's personal, general, and permanent, but also reflects an arc of making personal choices, an arc of skills and that are grown through practice and through personal investment, we actually create the growth mindset that Dr. Carol Dweck talks about, and the optimistic mindset that Dr. Seligman talks about. There isn't an either or. Both of these are different ways of looking at some underlying process that we humans don't really understand that well yet. And if any of you are motivated to go and do research in this area, please, I beg you, apply your enthusiasm. Go and learn. There's so much more that could help humanity in great ways in this area. I believe, now I have not done the research. I'm sharing with you an opinion. I'm not even going to grace it by calling it a theory or a conjecture, because I'm not about to go out and test these things. But I believe it is possible to construct explanations both for ourselves that we tell ourselves and for other people when we give feedback at work or to our friends, to our family, our children, that emphasize agency, choice, skills that can grow, but are also about being personal in positive areas, about being general, enthusiasm, research, and so on are not just about theory or math or infinity, and that emphasize a lifelong arc of growth. And the opposite. We can explain that the bad things are none of those. And this is the feedback that I try to live at PagerDuty with my colleagues. I try to emphasize personal choices people make. I try to generalize the results of those choices when they're positive. Remember learned optimism? Not all the time, just the positive ones. I try to talk about things in terms of this is an event on an ongoing arc. For example, I'm not going to tell you that your lives are all going to improve because of this talk. I don't actually even believe that's true. But what I do believe is you chose to come to this talk because you are interested in the way your own brains and moods work. You are interested in making positive change in your life. And whether this talk itself does something or not, I don't know. But I do know that you're likely to continue to do this. And you've probably done this before. And I have every confidence that if you continue to be curious about yourselves, and if you continue to say, I'm going to invest my time, that you are going to achieve some growth. You are going to go to a good place in your life. I give this all the time. Hey, the things you learned, I can see them coming through your code. Keep going. That's the most common thing I tell people. I don't say you're great. I say, keep doing what you do when you do what you do so well. Keep it up. Mind you, not everything is positive. Not everything works out well. Those are the fun ones to talk about. But from learned optimism, we want the asymmetry. When things aren't going well, the learned optimism model asks us to consider whether these things are personal or whether they're really impersonal. The learned optimism model asks us to think whether this is some general bad thing or whether it's just a very specific thing. And the learned optimism model asks us to consider, is this thing part of an ongoing bad thing that has been happening and will continue to happen until I'm dead? Or is it just this one time? And when we talk to ourselves or give feedback to others, we can de-emphasize the personal nature, we can make the event specific, and we can emphasize the temporary nature of this particular effect. You know, Reg, in a country that doesn't give a shit about baseball, a baseball jersey isn't necessarily the best choice. But it's just what you wore on stage. Don't give it a lot of thought. Just be curious about that the next time you're choosing what to wear. If you think about it, that feedback also emphasizes the fact that you can make a different choice at the next talk. It gives some positive thing going forward, but it doesn't sort of emphasize the fixed and permanent nature of bad things in your life. I actually don't think this jersey is bad, but what do I know? So, when explaining things to ourselves or to other people, again, we can be conscious about the way in which we do it. We know that when giving people feedback for performance improvement in their careers or in their lives, you do have to give them specific things to do and specific feedback, otherwise they can't improve. PagerDuty, we emphasize part of the methodology is after a major incident, you have to have a post-mortem. There's no good being completely wishy-washy. Well, in general, this is happening. You have to be specific. This should have happened and this should have happened. But we can cast the positive things as being specific items that are part of a larger pattern. And we can take the negative things and just talk about the specific item. It's not a compromise on reality. It's just the way in which we frame reality. Sometimes we have to give some feedback that's both positive and negative. We can start like this. Something very specific, very temporary. This blog post lacks a narrative. We can then smoothly shift gears into the positive and permanent. Again, these things become natural when you practice. We can learn to give feedback that fits the learned optimism model for negative things and fits both the learned optimism and growth model for positive things, both separately or together in one conversation with ourselves and with others. The two models really can fit. And so, when someone says, I'm not smart, but I've got grit, I say, this grit is what gives you the motivation to do all these great things and get these great results. Keep going. Love what you do. Keep doing it. Do more of it. Explore more ways to take this grit and make the world a better place. It's not a repudiation. In fact, it's a reinforcement of what I've learned, I believe, about being successful, about being happy, about seeing the world in a positive and welcoming way. So, this experience that I went through and still go through to this moment is very personal, and normally I wouldn't think of this as being a great talk for a software conference, but culturally, I've noticed that as an industry, we often have a fixed mindset. Anytime you read about, well, we're looking for smart people, you're listening to people who have the fixed mindset, not the growth mindset, right? And there's a lot of that going around. The negative feedback is almost always permanent. Oh, so-and-so is a bozo. Not so-and-so said a bozalicious thing. Or, Reg, you know, that particular thing you said doesn't, I'm sorry, it doesn't work. But Reg is a bozo. That's the fixed mindset right there. And so I do think this is important to share in a technical context because I do think it's a prevalent issue in our industry. However, I'm not a one-man crusade on this. I've noticed that things get better when people who care about it share. And in my lifetime, I've seen things get better. In my lifetime, I've seen more people complain about bad feedback and bad choices. Why? Because more people are aware. I see that positive. I see that in a positive way. We hear about it more because people have stopped putting up with the bullshit. And that's fantastic. That's how we change. Change comes when people protest and say, that's a stupid thing to say in a code review. So-and-so's a bozo. Stop it. Stop it. That's fantastic. As an industry, we are getting better. Not fast enough, but all of you who are doing something about this, keep doing what you do when you do what you do so well. Our industry is getting better and can get a lot better. And that's why I'm talking about it. So, wrapping up here with a nice picture of, I think it's called Harta in Reykjavik. There are the two models. The learned optimism model, which I spent the most time talking about because that was my strongest personal experience, and the growth mindset model by Dr. Seligman and Dr. Dweck, respectively. Or I should say Drs. Seligman and Dweck. I believe both of them have powerful things to tell us, and both of them have a model about how we can improve and change. I believe both of them provide us with a model for communicating with others and working with others, whether they be our colleagues or our friends, or feedback for me about my talk. I believe that this is more than just a personal thing, that it affects larger groups, teams, companies, the culture of an entire industry. I believe I've seen our industry on a positive arc, and that if we continue to do the kinds of things that have been working so far and step it up, things will get better faster. And that's why I came here to talk to you today. Thank you very much.